Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Wilson Kimball. I'm the President and CEO of the Municipal Housing Authority for the City of Yonkers. Welcome to our second MHACY Town Hall meeting. Today we plan to continue our discussion of some of the important programs at MHACY that we are doing during COVID-19, like Rent Cafe and enforce social distancing, and to answer many of your questions that come through Facebook. But in light of the murder of George Floyd, we felt it was important for us all to reflect on how we can move forward to channel change in public housing, in affordable housing, and in every aspect of our everyday lives. To that end, we invited some special guests today to share with us their feelings, emotions, and how they are coping with their sadness, frustration, and frankly, outrage. We will respond to any questions you may have through our social media on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, or you can call us about important issues regarding your rent. You can email us at section8info@macy.org. Now, for the topic at hand. For many of us, George Floyd's murder was outrageous. To watch the videotape of a police officer kneeling on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds left me with no words. But this was not the first time I have felt that way. When I read about Sandra Bland, who was pulled over in a traffic stop and ended up dead in a jail cell 3 days later, I was upset. When I started watching the HBO movie, Say Her Name, The Life and Death of Sandra Bland, which has the actual police footage of the stop and how she was slapped and terrorized, I was incensed. And yet, as a white woman in America, my anger, my outrage, and frankly, my ignorance of these repeated offenses is only a small part of a national narrative. So I'm here to listen and learn and try to understand a way forward. And so I'd like to introduce my guests today. I've asked them all to share with you some personal stories and to give all of us their advice on how to take the anger we all feel and turn it into something positive. Thus the name of our program, George Floyd Channeling Change. First, we have a very special guest, former Governor David Paterson, the first African-American to serve as governor of New York State, our 55th governor. And over 10 years ago, I saw him deliver a speech on social justice at an economic forum, and I was blown away by his message. An advocate, a leader, and a great thinker on social issues. We are so lucky to have him here today. Are we introducing everyone? Okay. Also joining us is our New York State Majority Leader, Senator Andrea Stewart-Cousins, who grew up in public housing and spent many years representing Yonkers on the city, county, and state levels. She is the first woman and the first African-American to serve as the majority leader of our state Senate. And I have heard her speak passionately about the injustices that were perpetrated against her father, a US veteran, who, when he was done serving our country. We also have our Deputy County Executive, Ken Jenkins, former chairman and of the County Board of Legislators, representing Yonkers, and a man I worked with at the IDA and at MHACY, who is a strong and powerful advocate. Also joining us is Assemblyman Gary Pretlow, representing Yonkers and Mount Vernon, who has spoken often and eloquently about the impact of segregation on Yonkers. And last but not least, the Reverend Julius Walls, pastor of Greater Hood Memorial AME Zion Church, who has led me and so many others in our community, not just in church, but through the church on Facebook during COVID. I've worked with him in community development, and I know for a fact he's a thoughtful, dedicated, and true thought leader. So today we have some prepared questions for our panel. The first one, I know the governor's time is precious, and we are so grateful. Experience, whether it was an act of racism perpetrated against you or an act of kindness that enlightened you, and how you used it for positive change.
I remember an act of racism and an act of kindness that occurred at the same time. When I was in the 4th grade, I was sent to integrate a school in Hempstead, Long Island, along with some other Black children. And there was a white kid in the class who thought he was the smartest kid in the class. And he didn't understand that I was the smartest kid in the class. So we were rivals and always arguing with each other. And finally, one day he invited me to come to his house on the next day to visit. And I went home and I said these things about him. And my mother said, listen, that's the first white kid that has invited anybody to his house. You're going. So I went over and I had a great time with him and his brother. We played in his house. And as they were getting ready to drive me home, this woman comes from down the street and starts talking about how someone knocked over her flower pots And my friend's mother said was sympathetic, and she kept yelling at her. And she said, "What are you yelling at me for?" And the woman said, "Well, you bring them in the neighborhood, and then when they do something, you don't seem to want to do anything about it." And my friend's mother was enraged by this. She practically chased the woman back into her house. And when she drove me home, she came in and had a conversation with my parents about it. And I just thought it was really amazing that she would take on that fight defending me. And I think it is something that Dr. King pointed out at the March on Washington in 1963, which, by the way, I was scheduled to attend with my parents. But the reason they didn't take me is there were threats of possible violence and vigilantism toward the marchers. And no one really talks about that these days. So what I'm saying is that this idea that all of us can be part of the struggle to bring economic, political, and social justice to our communities for all people is something that has gone on, and it's going to continue to go on. But this particular situation is a prima facie case of excessive use used by a police officer to subdue a suspect that manifested itself in a murder. And so I think that unfortunately, the distraction of some of the violence and some of the looting and that kind of thing is really ruining an immense opportunity, as tragic as the killing of George Floyd is, for us to really get America to move more than it has.
That is so well said. And I know I'm deviating from the pre-proposed questions, but I just wanted to ask you, did you feel the heavy burden when you were just in fourth grade and you were asked to take on this task? I mean, this is kind of a big task to ask a fourth grader.
Well, you know, I knew watching on television, those when the civil rights marches existed, and you know, I loved Dr. King and that kind of thing, but I was shocked, as I was other times when you know, this type of treatment raised its ugly head. When I was studying for an exam, I was in college, and I was home in Long Island. Someone broke into the house, and I jumped out the second floor window to run away and save my life. I got to a hospital a few blocks away, and they let me call the police. As I'm walking back to my house, the police come and take me into custody. And you know, so you know, those are just things that when you look back, they must have psychologically been affecting you. But what you tried to do is just move forward from them.
That's a great message. Thank you. I so appreciate those stories, such firsthand. Senator Majority Leader Andrew Stewart-Cousins, would you like to share a story with us of that you thought of or noticed or felt deeply at some point was a way forward for all of us to learn from? Oh, we may have lost her. Keep going. Senator Stewart-Cousins, was there an experience that you had, either an act of racism perpetrated against you or an act of kindness that enlightened you and showed you a positive change?
Yes. Hi, Wilson. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good.
A little bit because we can't see you.
Okay, I'm trying to get you. There we go. There you go. Okay, good. I was telling you I was en route, and so I changed locations, and I had an opportunity to hear my good friend Governor Patterson speak, and you know, I said I'm just always pleased to be in a space with him because of the kind of history that he's made as an African American in New York State, and certainly he was instrumental in you know, my success in my career in the Senate, and you know, to hear his insights is always kind of inspiring. And while I was thinking about what to say, you know, the reality and listening to you in your intro, you know, I think the kindest thing, quite honestly, is happening right now. The kindest thing for people who have lived with these realities for so long, to have people who have, you know, for whatever the myriad reasons, not really registered the pain, the inequities, the injustices, the everyday transgressions that happen to people because of the color of the skin they're in. For that to have been the history of either willfulness or ignorance of the reality that was happening for enough people who aren't, in the skin, to finally stop and pause and join with others who have been fighting this alone, is probably the kindest thing I have seen in a long time. To be invited as I am to a Black Lives Matter rally in Dobbs Ferry is amazing to me. And so that kind of kindness that extends humanity to everyone and is reflective enough to know the part that you've played, not you personally, but others have played willingly or unwillingly, and joining with people to say that the American dream is a dream that really is rooted in equality and justice. And any part you are playing not to have that happen is really, really making the dream not come true. And I think America can be better. I know Maya Angelou, I remember listening to whatever, and I don't even remember the poem, but basically she was saying how she had traveled all over the world and, she'd met a lot of great people and so on and so forth. But one person called her a nigger on the bus. And that was the only thing she remembered of the entire trip. That was fabulous. That one insensitive, terrible moment was the only thing she remembered. And so when you see this terrible tragedy with George Floyd, and everyone has been forced to absorb the tragedy, the symbolism, and the unacceptability of what has happened, we all have to resolve to do better. I grew up in public housing, yes. I grew up in public housing, and I'll just say it briefly, because when my dad got out of the military, having been wounded, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, in a segregated military, when public housing was designed, it was designed for people like my dad. Black soldiers who, because of discrimination and racism, was not allowed to partake in the suburbs of Levittown, where white soldiers were practically being given housing so that they could set up their families in suburbia. But the government had a covenant that said, we will not allow Black people in the suburbs, and we will not allow Jews. And the government was a conspirator in the segregation that leads to public housing today. That's where we grew up, because that was the best they would do. And that was sanctioned. Here I am in a position as, again, you said, the first woman leader, an African-American woman leader, despite what happened to my parents and to me, and yes, to my Black children. I have 2 Black boys, both of whom have had very unpleasant interactions with police. I have 4 grandsons. I am hoping that my being in a position like this, following in the footsteps of the first Black governor, all these great firsts, you'll hear from, my assembly member and my deputy county executive and all these historic figures. And of course, Reverend Walls, who leads a historic church. You will hear from all of us that our roads and our paths weren't easy, that many of us never expected to be where we are. But this moment of influence, with the support of a community that is tired, and another community and other communities that have finally gotten it, I will use my position to continue to move us forward. so that my grandkids will not be wringing their hands or suffering at the hands of injustice or willful ignorance of the plight of their fellow human beings. So thank you for giving me the time, and I look forward to hearing the others.
We're so grateful to have you here. We also are joined by Ken Jenkins, our Deputy County Executive. Hello.
Hey, and good afternoon, and everyone, and certainly, Wilson, thank you and Yonkers Municipal Housing for pulling this together for us to have this conversation with the folks that are on the phone, between good friends like Governor David Patterson and certainly the leader, Andrea Stewart Cousins, and all of our friends and family with Gary Pretlow, Assemblyman Gary Pretlow, and Julius Walls, and all the folks that are out there that have the stories. One of the things, Wilson, and I think that this is one of the things that you'll hear from all of us, we all have a story to tell about a challenge in the community that we faced along the way. And whether that was, as Governor Patterson said, and as a fourth grader and being in that particular position, Senator Stewart Cousins and talking about being in public housing and dealing with that things. Gary Pretlow has his stories, and certainly Reverend Walls does as well. The challenge for us at this particular time is that because of the convergence of the coronavirus issues and the disparities that happen on Black and Brown people, as well as this particular scenario, which has been a long-running scenario with the accountability or lack of accountability for the police department, and the injustices that have happened, as you said, as you started out, has made us all sick to our stomach, and we're sick and tired of being sick and tired. So one of the challenges for me specifically, most people know that my father was a police officer. So it gives even a different scenario, because I have an opportunity to be on one side as an African-American male, and then watching the scenario with my dad, who was a cop in New York City and retired as a sergeant in New York City, and being involved and being abused myself by police during the blackouts in the 70s when there was a lot of looting and rioting that was going on. Clearly, I was not participating in any of those kind of things. And again, as many of us and all of us in the positions that we hold and the ability to have impact, to make changes, that the hardest part for all of us is that we say, wait, we can't protect our own children in those scenarios. And that is the hardest thing for all of us. I think this moment that where we are right now is different, and we are going to make some changes because of all of the people that are getting together to say, wait, we're just not accepting of this anymore. There's been a ton of individuals that have unfortunately lost their life at the hands of the police in an unfortunate manner. And now we have, again, all of these things happening, but we have people that are in power that can make a difference and that can make the changes that are necessary. And it would be, it would be sinful and shameful for us for not to be able to take this moment and to be able to make those changes that are going to be impactful, long-lasting, and again, working together with everyone that has been goodwill. As all of us have been engaged, I think I'm on, for us in Westchester, we've been in many different rallies and marches and support throughout Westchester County. And it didn't matter where in Westchester County, that people are angry and upset, and they want to make a difference and a change. And that's really what I'm hoping that we're all going to be able to do, to listen and then have accountability. Most people want to make some changes, and those changes are accountability, starting with everyone should be treated the same. When we see someone that is done something that is horrific, and you see that on video, it shouldn't take a week to determine whether or not someone gets arrested. If that happened in the public housing units, that person gets arrested, and then the DAs do the stuff that the district attorneys do and evaluate charges, et cetera, and those things take time to do, but people get immediately impacted by an arrest. We need to fix some of those things, and we need to make sure that we fix some of the the things that happen with confidentiality and creativity. If someone gets arrested, well, that record is public record. It doesn't say that that person got convicted. It said that person got arrested. We need to make sure that those policies are the same. So I'm hopeful again, because there are so many people out there that have the goodwill to say, let's not just talk about the change, and let's not talk about the changes that we need. We're not just having a rally and a meeting and a conversation, that we're gonna have some things that positively change, because we have individuals that know that it cannot continue the same way that it is. So I'm looking forward to hearing from all of our other additional colleagues out there. And thank you for having the opportunity to participate this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Ken. And is Assemblyman Gary Pretlow online? No, so we are going to go right to Julius Walls. Hi, Reverend. Thank you for joining us today. Can you talk about your experiences?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I appreciate you putting this together. And when you reached out, because of who you are, it was easy for me to accept and participate. Then I was excited to see who you were going to have on here. And I'm just glad I could be on here to hear what these wonderful people have to say. My very, very good friend, and I know that that term is thrown out there by everyone, but she is my very, very good friend, Andrea Stewart Cousins, and she knew who I was talking about when I started. And my very, very good friend, Ken Jenkins, who is my neighbor and known for a number of years, lived down the block from each other. And then the governor, I didn't preface it with my very, very good friend, because I don't throw those terms around, but I is someone that I respect and have admired for years. Haven't had the chance to get to know him as closely as I do the others, but just someone that I do know of and what he's done. And it's so great to be on with each one of you. When I read that question, heard that question, what immediately came up for me is my son. I'm the father of 3 children. The oldest and youngest are girls, but my son, who carries my name, is Julius Walls III, was a student at Morehouse College. He graduated from Morehouse College with a double bachelor's from Morehouse and Rensselaer Polytech in engineering and applied physics. And he was planning to take a spring break trip. I think it was his sophomore year at Morehouse, the historic Black college for men, because my daughter will argue with you that the historic Black college is Spelman, and she graduated from there. But when he was on his way to a spring trip, he was going to Florida. I forget which city, say it was Daytona, Florida. He and 2 other gentlemen from Morehouse, 2 other African-American gentlemen from Morehouse, were going to pile in their car, drive out of Atlanta, so in the back roads of Georgia, through South Carolina to Florida. And my conversation with him was, if you get stopped, say yes, sir, no, sir, be kind, do not argue with them. And I said, even if you think your rights are being abused, do not say that to them. Do not tell them that your rights are being abused. Just get out of that situation with your life. And as I reflected on the conversation after I had that with him, first off, let me finish and say that I then told him he needs to have that same conversation with his 2 friends, that they need to understand that they need to just get out of the situation and get home safely. And after you get home, then you call me and you tell me if your rights have been abused, and I will get into it with the authorities, but you cannot. I said, if you get into any trouble, we may never hear from you again. We won't know what happened to you. You'll just have disappeared, and it'll be days before we know that you've disappeared, maybe weeks, and we won't know where to find you or anything like that. And I said, unfortunately, he kind of chuckled, and I said, I'm not joking. I'm absolutely serious. And as I reflected upon that conversation that I had with him, I actually teared up, welled up about the fact that I just told my son to not stand up for his rights. I told my son that he shouldn't do that. And by implication, I was telling him that I couldn't do that either, that we needed to just get out of the situation and get home. And I said, what does that teach him about his own self-esteem, his own ability to stand up for himself? And it's a shame. It's a crying shame that that's the case. And just yesterday, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who lives in Minneapolis, a close, very close friend of mine who's white, and he has all of the privileges of whites in Minneapolis, including he's of means. And he asked me, he said, but what does it mean to you now that this was not a young Black African-American? This wasn't a 12 or 14 or 16-year-old. This wasn't even a 20-something-year-old. This was a man of age. This was a full-grown man. He's saying, because there was an understanding that this couldn't happen to me. And I said, well, I never had that understanding, that this couldn't happen to me. I did believe that if I got into a situation, I could, quote unquote, talk my way out of it, be respectful enough, use language that might calm down the authorities that were before me, even though, by the way, that's not my role. I shouldn't have to do that. But I'm talking to my son and telling him that he needs to be subservient and almost to the point of saying, yes, massa, no, massa. But if he used that language, I know he would be considered to being one that was making fun of them. I said, so don't do any of that, but you need to get out of the situation. And that's a shame that's the society that we live in. I am more hopeful. I'm grateful to hear what the leader said, what Ken said, and Governor Patterson said about the day and age in which we're in. And maybe this is the turning point. And I know we'll have some more conversation about what that looks like. So I am hopeful about that. But we still live in a day and an age right now where I'm still concerned about my son if I don't hear from him for a couple of days. He lives in upstate New York, in Troy, New York, and I'm still concerned about him. And that's a shame that I have to have that kind of worry for him. And he has to have that kind of worry. His mother has to have that kind of worry. And I'm prayerful and hopeful that the system changes, that his grandson won't have that kind of fear in his life.
That is such a powerful story. Governor, I want to bring it back to you because that's a great struggle, right? You have children. How do you balance what you tell your children about if there's a line there between what's right and what's wrong, and how to stand up for yourself without crossing somebody? You know, when you watch the video of the Sandra Bland thing, she was just smoking a cigarette. That police officer reached in the car, slapped her, and dragged her out. She wasn't being disrespectful. She was just in her own car. So how do you tell young people how to make that balance, do that balance?
It's very difficult. And I know that my father died in April of 2014. If he had died in April of 2013, there's something about him I never would have known. The day after the conviction, what am I talking about? The day after the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the Trayvon Martin case, we're all sitting around the table telling these stories. And he told a story. He was 16 years old. He got off the subway at 116th Street and 8th Avenue, where he lived. And he was coming from playing stickball. And the police officer asked him where he got the glove from. And he told him it was his glove, and the officer pistol whipped him. He had to be sent to the hospital. There were 20 witnesses to this attack. The NAACP came to my grandparents' house and wanted them to bring a lawsuit against the police department in the city of New York. And my father's father said to the police, yeah, we could do that, but who's in the streets protecting my son? So my father had to witness a situation where he couldn't get justice. And I think that's what really catapulted him into wanting to get justice for all the people who couldn't get it, as he was one of them as a younger person. I think that what I've always tried to tell younger people and my own son is you have to choose your battles. When you're standing there with the police and they have guns and you don't have one, and they have the right to do something to you and then make up a story as if you started a fight with them, you might have to let that one go. But there are plenty of times that you can come to a march, you can add your voice to others. And I think Dr. King said it the most when he said that what he despised more than people who were prejudiced were people who were not prejudiced and didn't speak out against it when it occurred. And so I think that's really, you know, sometimes when you're in the moment and you're in a situation, you're being challenged by law enforcement, and we've all had that moment, you have to play it cool for a minute, but there'll be chances to return that fire later on.
Such a great point. Senate Majority Leader, what do you tell your sons and grandsons about that balance in your life?
You know, I think everyone has articulated it well. I mean, we all have to, you know, you cannot raise children in fear. You cannot accomplish anything if if you are rooted in fear, if you raise your kids to be afraid. But you have to raise them with the understanding that there are injustices in the world, and the injustices, certainly in the case of Black people, has been ongoing and really deeply seated. And we can make those changes, but you're not going to make the changes by yourself and every opportunity picking a battle and seeing who gets left standing. My mother and father were very deeply rooted in faith, and they taught us something that is still true today. Education is so important. Knowledge is power. They can take a lot of things away from you, my mother used to say, but they can't take what's up in here. And the reality is that the difference is you knowing what's right, what's wrong, you pursuing the best you can be. And that means, you know, educate yourself, about history, whatever it is you care about, get that education. And understand that each and every one of us has the power to make a difference. We know what happened to George Floyd because a 17-year-old kid was recording that. 17-year-old young person, not old enough to vote, but old enough to look at that and say, wait a minute, this is something that needs to be captured. So everybody in their space can make a difference. And that's what I tell my kids. I tell them to get their education, to, you know, and I think what Julia said and what the governor said and what Ken said is true. You know, every fight you're not going to fight, we all have stories. You know, you want to live to be able to fight, you know, when you need to fight. Because if you're scared and they're scared and they got a gun and a badge, guess who wins? So,
Ken, you have kids, I know. What do you talk to your kids about?
We all had, again, we had that education, and just like Julius was telling Julius III, that you know, you should do the question, you do whatever the authorities say first and ask questions later, and that was my father telling me that kind of thing, and that's what I tell my children. As you know, my youngest guy, my little guy, is 6'3" and almost 300 pounds, right? He's the kind of guy, when you look at him, that the police say, oh, wait a second, there's going to be a problem, because he's just a big guy, right? And that makes it even harder for us, because we're trying to explain to our children that, hey, wait, we want you to speak out. We want you to stand up for yourself, but not in this situation, because as Senator has just said, it's like, wait a minute, we want you to come home, and then we'll have that battle later on, as Julius and Governor Patterson were just talking about. We're going to go out and have that fight. We'll argue for you. We'll go out and make that argument, and we'll stand up for you. But it is a really challenging balance for African-American families or Black families to be telling their children, stand up for your rights, but don't stand up over here, because that may put you in a situation where you're not going to come home, right? and or you're going to get hurt, or you're going to get arrested. And you know what? That part is a real balance and a challenge when you're trying to explain that to folks and to our children. And then we're in positions of power, and you know, whether we're parents, mothers and fathers, and we're talking to our children look up to us. You know, we have those things, and they look up and they go, wait a minute, you're telling me don't do what you always stood up to do. You always went out to articulate and say, hey, let me stand up for someone else. But you know what? I can't worry about my own children. And again, I'm referring to Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms in Atlanta, when she was talking about the things that were happening in the evening, and we're watching it live on television. And, you know, as a former NACP president and all the folks that are on the line, NACP folks as well, that we turned around and I was hurt, and I'm watching the scenario. I'm like, wait a second, this is getting ready to go into a very, very bad territory where someone's going to get hurt. And that's the kind of things that we're trying to explain to our children and say to them, hey, yes, this is wrong and this is what we need to stand up, but we need to continue to work together to get through those scenarios and hold people accountable and keep working through that. So it is absolutely a difficult challenge to tell those children to do that. I have 2 boys and a girl. And of course, you know, the young lady is a vice principal in the school district, and trying to be able to explain that to how to manage in these situations with authority. And when you have that authority, as again, all of the folks that you have on the call today have, it is a super duper challenge for us to make sure that we're explaining how we can use our power to help make a difference.
So I know thank you, Ken. That's, all these insights are fresh and new to me, and I hope they are to our viewers as well. I mean, obviously I knew horrible things were happening. I didn't know really until Governor Patterson gave that speech 10 years ago, how bad, how historic, how daily, almost daily this is, and how prevalent, and how out of touch I was, how I lived in a bubble, so untouched by these things. And it's just so wrong. I want to start our wrap up. So Julius Walls, Reverend, do you want to start the wrap up? Because I know everyone's on a tight schedule. So you started this great debate. Can you start the wrap up, please?
I was talking and I was muted. The piece that I was bringing out is the fact that we all have to have, and there's even a term for this if you've never heard it, we've all had to have the talk. This is the notion that you'll hear. It's even now come into culture and it's on TV and such. But I want to shift a little bit to solutions, because this issue that happened with George Floyd and the numerous other names and the nameless that we don't know about is a symptom. And I am grateful and hopeful that the majority leader will be able to put some changes in place at the state level. Hopeful, not as hopeful, quite frankly, for the federal level at this moment. I'm not as hopeful, but I hope that there's something that gets moved there, and they'll put some things in place around how police conduct themselves. But that's still a symptom. I don't merely want my son to be able to merely walk down the street without fearing for his life. I want my son to be able to walk down the street and have the same opportunities that others have that don't look like him. And so I'd like us to put in place some systemic solutions for a systemic problem. As I'm preparing now for this coming Sunday, I'm getting into some research, and some things are blowing me away about some of the things that are out there. And so I'll just do one of them, because I could do a whole bunch of them, but I want to do just home ownership. And what I found out about home ownership is home ownership has a lot to do with the previous generation's home ownership and wealth level. And which obviously had a lot to do with the previous generation of wealth and home ownership. And so we're getting into this whole scenario that most of us can remember, talked about or experiencing ourselves, about the grandfather clause. You can't vote if your grandfather didn't vote. Well, it's not as blatant as a rule, you can't own a house if your grandfather didn't own a house, but statistics clearly show If your grandfather and your father didn't own a house, it is less likely that you will own a house. And society is asking us to run a race that has been started years before. They're down, we're not talking about they're down the track a ways. They've done several laps. And now they're saying you can now start running and see if you can compete. And this system needs to change. We had a GI Bill that Black soldiers were not allowed to participate in, yet that was the major spurring of home ownership for whites. And now again, generations later, we still don't own the houses because we still don't have a GI Bill that a bill that does the things in the same way it did for those that were not African American, those that are not Black and brown in this country. So we need some systemic solutions. It was the whole reason behind the 40 acres and a mule. And people make fun of that, make light of it on both sides, make too much light of it. But that was the whole point of it. It was that you were already behind the 8 ball. Here's a chance to get you caught up a little ways. It's the conversation needs to come back up. And I know it's a bad word. Reparations needs to come back up because we're so far behind in our education, in our wealth, in our home ownership, if we don't do something systemic, something large that needs to be sustained over time, that we will never catch up. I don't believe there's a bill that catches us up now. I don't think there's a law that catches us up now. There are laws that can be put in place that will protect us more now, but they won't catch us up now. We'll be caught up over generations, but nothing that's being put in place is looking at catching us up over generations. And that's the kind of solutions we need. It requires sacrifice on the part of those that are in power with resources now for them to sacrifice their power and their resources. And then it requires even those of us, you have on the line with you, those of us who have had some success, who've had some power and some resources put into our hands, and it requires us to sacrifice. Are we willing to sacrifice so that someone else who doesn't have and doesn't know what they don't have can have? We talk about the expression, and I'll close with this. We talk about the expression of you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. I've always said, but have you told the horse why he needs water? Have you educated him on why he needs to have, she needs to have the water so that they can go after it and drink it? And that's where this system has failed. People of color, it has not educated, it has not provided the resources, it has not provided the opportunities, and those things will not happen overnight, and we won't be able to achieve the level of success that families and others have achieved over generations. And if you come, my last comment is that others that come to this country now will say, or just a generation ago, well, I'm not responsible for that. But you actually get to benefit from the privilege of that. I live in the home that I live in Yonkers, New York, in Runyon Heights, the first African-American middle-class neighborhood in Westchester. I live there now because the realtor took me to a Black neighborhood, not a white neighborhood. Now I'm ecstatic and happy to be where I'm at and where I live. But that's how I got there. And because that guy said, I'm not taking you to these other houses, I'm taking you to this house. And that's the system that we live in. And we need to put things in place that change the overall system and then have the patience and the fortitude to stay with it over generations.
Patterson, would you like to have some closing remarks? Because these are all really important points that we can take with us. And the last time I saw you speak was 10 years ago, and I'm still carrying that with me. So,
well, thank you very much for that, Ms. Kimball. There was a series of articles and also tweets and pod broadcasts last year, authored by a writer by the name of Nicole Hannah-Jones. It was called the 1619 Project. And what she submits is that the courage of the African-American men and women, and some white men and women as well, between 1619 and 1863, 244 years, finally ended the enslavement of people in this country, and then inevitably desegregation, and inevitably some attempt at giving economic and social justice to Black Americans. The funny thing is that all the conservative newspapers, the National Review, the one that's in Washington, I can't think of its name, they all panned what Ms. Jones had to say and what they said to her. And I think this really illuminates for all of us where we are with some people in society today is, why didn't she focus on some of the great achievements in the settlement of America by the settlers? Well, if ending slavery wasn't a great achievement, if establishing citizenship so you would be 5/5 rather than 3/5 of a human being wasn't a great achievement, what about granting the vote for women? We're celebrating that 100 years later. That was a great achievement, but they didn't see it that way. And so when you talk to a number of people about slavery or some of these things from years ago, I had nothing to do with it. I don't know who did that. It's as if, it was in an alternative universe. But if you talk to them about the Revolutionary War, they say, we won the Revolutionary War. We won the War of 1812. We won the First and Second World Wars. What about the Civil War? We won the Civil War, but what about slavery? We don't know anything about it. And so this amnesia that has haunted mostly white America continues to exist, where you can't get a jury to convict a police officer who strangled a man in Staten Island in 2014, and his name was Eric Garner. Now we're going to find out if a jury can convict a policeman who sat with his foot on the neck of a Black man for nearly 9 minutes. And what I think we really need at this point is a change of focus in this country from denial, which is what I think is the new racism. It just denies the existence of racism itself and takes no responsibility for inequality. How did all these people wind up living in poor housing? Because they just got there. And I think that this is really what our charge should be as we leave this really great conversation and move forward and try to get people who, for the most part, are good people to understand that the reason they are hesitant to ever convict police officers is because police officers live in their neighborhood. They play on the softball team. They are people that you know and love because they live in your neighborhood. Well, in the Black neighborhoods, up until very recently, none of those people could get on the police force. The only time we saw the police was when they were coming to arrest someone, and even just stopping people randomly to harass them. And things have certainly changed. You would be really unfair if you didn't say that over the past 30 or 40 years, things have not changed for the better. But you would be a charlatan if you didn't understand that things have to change more.
Exactly so. Senator Stewart-Cousins?
Yes. Yeah. Well, listen, I think it's amazing, again, that this conversation is happening, that it is happening in this thoughtful way. And it is only because of the twin viruses that have taken such a deadly toll on our communities all over the globe that we have stopped long enough to actually have the conversation, because we were paused long enough to have to, stay in our houses, really, break all of the things that we were conditioned to doing and thinking and so on. And we all knew that there were two viruses, certainly in the Black community. There was the virus of racism and the virus of COVID. And the fact that we were stuck in having disparate impacts because of the virus of COVID did allow, when the virus of racism moved COVID from the headline, sort of, it allowed folks to just take a real look and understand what people have been talking about for generations and generations. And because we've all had an opportunity to really, say now that we see it, I think the amnesia that the governor was talking about is going to be harder to claim. I think that it's not about me, I didn't do anything, when you realize that there is a significant difference in people's lives, just because of the skin they're in. You can't say you didn't know that anymore because you've been forced to stay quiet enough, long enough to see it, to hear it, and to feel it. What Reverend Walls didn't say is that, yeah, they only showed him this Black neighborhood, but they didn't say that Black neighborhood was created because there was a big fence and a division that was created by the government to segregate that Black neighborhood. Just like the wealth that I don't have because my father wasn't given a house because he was Black leads us to municipal housing. And the big wealth gap between Black and white. It's easy for people to think that people are in bad shape because they're just bad people, especially when they're criminalized, especially when they're marginalized, especially when their rights are trampled on. And it's easy for people to say they don't know because it's not happening to them. But the reason why it's different now is because nobody can claim ignorance, nobody can claim amnesia, and there's a lot of people out there like you, Wilson, who will not be willfully ignoring the plight. And then there's people like us who, for one moment or another, have power, whether it's in the pulpit or in the legislative chambers and executive branches. And we will be using what we can to do what we have to do. But we can't be episodic. We can't forget. And because I have this position, because of politics, because people vote, people gotta be clear that who's showing up in all of these places are showing up because people are electing them or electing not to be involved. We are all involved. Take voting very seriously. If you could vote, you don't have to show up anywhere. You could vote absentee, we'll send it, but don't believe that changes will happen without the right people being in a position to make those changes, because it's not going to happen overnight. They're systemic and they have been intergenerational. Unfortunately, it is as old as the history of this country. And you've got to exercise your right to vote in order to make those changes.
Thank you so much. And Ken Jenkins, not lastly, the last word.
Well, first, Wilson, thank you again for you bringing all of us together to have this conversation and starting out with something that you pointed out, that you said, wait, I didn't really understand things a certain way. And you're a wonderful person. We work together and we can see different things, and you're doing an outstanding job in your vision for the Municipal Housing Agency and trying to bring those things together. I want to start with two things. One, we can't echo enough with Senator Stewart Cousins was just mentioning about making sure that you vote. Killer Mike, who's a rapper down in Atlanta, when he was out and talking about that and expressing that, he's like, listen, one thing we have to do is if we see injustice, well, you got to get out and vote to put people in office that could help make a change. And if they're not making a change, then you need to vote for somebody else, right? But you need to always participate and get involved in that. And certainly Governor Patterson understands that and the things that he's been engaged and involved with. But the other thing is to make sure that you take the time to do the census and count. And certainly in municipal housing, and Yonkers has one of the challenges of trying to get those numbers up, because again, if you're not doing that census, you're not counting, and guess what? There's an opportunity for government to overlook some of the things that have to happen. And we know from this scenario right now that because of the twin viruses, as Senator Stewart Cousins pointed out, and the things that the Reverend Walls was mentioning, to make sure that we are taking this opportunity to not just talk about those changes that are necessary, because they did not happen overnight. And as Governor Patterson pointed out with the 1619 project, there's 400 years of that. So anyone that thinks that this is going to be a short battle and be able to just turn the things and turn the page and say, okay, we're good, that's not the case. We definitely need people to do things and get trained in implicit bias, and whether that's in executive management positions, like you have, but on police opportunities to have that implicit bias kind of training and say, hey, I grew up in a certain community, and this is the individuals that I grew up with. I had the exact same story that Julius Walls has as far as where I got to live. We live in Runyon Heights for the same exact reason that a real estate agent showed us houses in a Black community, right? Now, someone might say, oh, wait a minute, oh, that's because you'll be comfortable there. Is that no, that meant that the person had already made a decision that this was the neighborhood to be in. And as Senator Stewart Cousins pointed out, there's still that wall that's between the communities where the streets don't connect. And in your former position, Wilson, you know the streets don't connect between Homefield and Runyon Heights. The streets physically don't connect, right? They're just next door to each other with a cemetery in between them. So again, one of the things that we have to do is we have to continue to have those conversations to make sure that we're holding people accountable. We need to make sure that we're getting out to vote to change those folks when they do not do what they need to do as far as that accountability is concerned. But we also need to have some of these things that we're doing right now, Wilson. And again, it's to your credit to have this conversation, to bring that. It's an uncomfortable conversation, right? You know, whenever we have these kind of conversations, people are really kind of tiptoeing through the tulips because they don't want to make sure to offend anyone. And as Julia said, and we all said the same thing, it's like, listen, you know, people need to be offended about some of the things that have happened and said, well, I didn't really realize that was the case. You know, someone posted a story on Facebook with me, and it was with John Murtaugh. And it was a conversation that we had because we both went to the same school, which was Fordham Prep. So we both went to Fordham Prep. So we were 2 years or so apart. And he was relating the story I told him, which was he would never understand what it would be like to walk through a store and have somebody follow him around, ever, right? And he understood. He said, you know what, I'm telling this story when I was president of NACP and he was a city council member, and I was just trying to explain to him, you know what, it doesn't make a difference how much money I have. It doesn't make a difference what car I drove, my house or anything like that, that we have a certain thing. And this is the time that now we need to work through that, deal with all of those challenges. And again, this is a first step in that kind of conversation, and that step in the direction that's necessary. Wilson, we really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, and certainly with all of my friends that are on the call, because they're all friends of mine that we've been working with for so many years together in this battle. And the challenge for us in this level, because we are all of a certain age group, right, that says we've been fighting this fight, and we go, we're sick and tired of being sick and tired, and we're always doing the battle and always putting the gear on each and every day. But we're not stopping, and we're telling people they shouldn't stop either. So again, thank you for the opportunity to speak this afternoon.
Wilson, you're mute.
Unmute, Wilson.
Unmute.
Benville out of school, but this is the best education I've ever gotten. And I want to thank the governor for giving me homework. So I'll be looking up the 1619 project, and I'll be going through that myself. So thank you all. This is so important, and I'm so appreciative.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye,
For having us.
Thanks, Wilson. All right. You have a great day.
Wilson.